welcome to yet another fabulous presentation at the Data Platform Summit in 2020. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about visualization magic in the age of numbers and science. I decided to update the title from Unlocking New Visualizations and Features as I felt this instilled a bit more of the magic and aesthetic design that I like to incorporate as part of my creative process into reports and visuals. Now before we get started, I want to go ahead and introduce myself a little bit. My name is Reid Havens and I've been in the industry now for about 10 years, in general doing report development and other stuff related to BI for about the last 7. I've also owned my own business for about the last 5, and I've also been working full-time with it for about the last 3. I actually do a lot of content both on YouTube and occasionally the blog as well, and I release those every Tuesday. And by the way, there will be links to those at the very end of this talk, so if you have any desire to want to check out more of my content, you're welcome to check it out there. But as you can see with the image on the top with the little avatar that I have that kind of looks like a wizard, and with the nickname down here below called the VizWiz, and let me actually go ahead and turn on my laser pointer to point out some of these things. There we go. I've had a way that I've ended up embracing a lot of the aesthetic design that I found in Power BI and in reports in general, because there's a lot of good data models that I've seen that are out there, but many of them fall flat when it comes to using the right visuals, being built in a way that's easy to read, or just aesthetically pleasing, that looks like it was polished by an artist. So I've really found that I've found a nice specialty in kind of pairing both the left and right brain worlds, and really just been able to fuse, kind of data science and analytics with aesthetics and design. So that's kind of the specialty that I have, and a lot of the stuff that I'll be sharing with you today. I'll also mention that I really enjoy both consulting, designing, and teaching. I do teach at a local university where I'm from here in Seattle, Washington, right near Microsoft, and honestly, it's some of my richest experiences with working with people is really just being able to have conversations, and I have found that I've often just loved the interactions that I get when people can learn and take their Power BI reporting and everything to the next level from some of the cool things that I'm able to show them. It's one of the ways that I learned when I was first getting started, and I hope it's a way you can learn as well. So let's talk about what we'll be going over for, the next 60, 70 minutes. So there's a series of demonstrations that I have in front of us, and each one of these is going to talk about various different tips and techniques in Power BI. We're going to start the conversation by discussing some line chart conditional formatting, things that you might not be able to do just out of the box without kind of finding this hidden feature. We're also going to show some really useful ways to do custom visual header tooltips. I recently just fell in love with the Smart Narrative tooltip, where this is something where we can take the new Smart Narrative visual and actually incorporate it into a report tooltip. We'll also see some clever ways to actually layer some visuals, have some hover tooltips, and also talk about card alignment, which isn't possible on the single value card. I'm also going to show you one of my personal favorites, which is the matrix table heat map. Basically, how to turn a table into a heat map. We're also going to talk about some custom KPI cards that can actually incorporate a health bar by, again, layering some visuals. Continuing the conversation, we're going to also go over some really cool ways to use DAX to actually incorporate kind of a breadcrumb trail into a title. And then last but not least, we'll also talk about some time perspectives with bookmarks and how to actually use bookmarks to toggle some hierarchy controls and some really creative ways to implement them. And most of this presentation is going to be a demo in Power BI, so let's go ahead, switch over to Power BI, and get started. So like I mentioned, what we have in front of us here is a report that actually has something that we normally can't find in the native visual when we want to add certain elements to it. And that is more specifically any of these little KPI dots that are right here. So this, etc., any of these, the green, the yellows, the reds, these are not things that can normally be added. So you might be asking yourself, like, how did these get put into there? And I'll first show you the pain problem. The fact that this, if I come over, do a zoom in, and go over to my format painter, I take a look down under data colors, you'll notice that there is no option for any kind of conditional formatting in here. Typically what you would see in this section right here is an icon that would be for conditional formatting. There would be an f of x symbol and you'd be able to click it, and that would take you to a menu to apply some conditional formatting. So then the broader question becomes, how did I add this to this visual? Now what I will say with this one is it's kind of like a happy accident that I stumbled across for this. So there has been certain techniques that I kind of find accidentally, and this was one of them. So the beautiful thing with Power BI is that you can actually start from one visual and convert it to another one. So very often I will save myself some time to reuse, let's say, the background color formatting, the title formatting. So you can actually copy and paste a visual, make another copy of it, and then from there you can come up here, convert it to a different visual, and then use it from there as kind of a template for a new one. So that's how I ended up coming across a scenario. I had started with a clustered column chart. You see that in here? And that has all of the information that we need as far as the conditional formatting in there. And you can kind of see if I actually go look at the format painter in here, and I come down to data colors, look at that. There's an option to apply conditional formatting in here. So I'm going to go ahead and clear this. And you can see that there's an f of x symbol. If I select that, give that a second for the menu to pop up. There we are. You can see that any kind of a conditional formatting rules can be applied in here. Now, the one that I actually applied to give the 3 colors was just a percentile. So I'm going to go ahead, go back to my format painter, go to data colors, show that off again. There we go. Basically, 33, 66, and up. So there's the 3 percentage buckets that has the 3 colors. The conversation here is less on the colors or the rules as the fact that I can apply it as a column chart first, and then if I convert it, it goes and stays on the line. Now let me Control Z a couple times because I do want to go back to having my, there we go, my forecast lines and everything else. But you can see that that goes into here and it works just as it should. Now, I will mention another caveat in this situation where if you see things like this that may or may not be a bug and you want to know like, hey, are these little dots going to go away at some point if I implement this in production? Well, what I did is I emailed Microsoft to double check and confirm to them that this is something that they are aware of and they're not going to get rid of it. So it's safe to implement. And it's something that I typically recommend people to do whenever they are exploring anything like this, is you really don't want to push something to production that might disappear in a couple of months with a bug when a patch goes through for that. So this is something that's safe. It's not the easiest to implement. Someday I hope this presentation gets obsolete and they add an f of x symbol right here so I can do it directly inside of the line chart. But for now, you can configure it by starting with another visual, as an example, the clustered column chart, and then convert it, and those icons will stick. You're not allowed to change the size at all, so they are stuck in as that size and also as a circle, so there's no way to change the symbol, but otherwise it still provides a nice way to have those buckets where you can have the top one here, the middle one you can kind of see where you automatically, just with your eyes, you can kind of see where those ranges start to fall for each of these 3 sections. So a really useful implementation of some conditional formatting in here. All right, a couple of other things that I want to mention as well is the analytics lines. So we're going to come over to the analytics pane. Now, if you haven't used this before, I would highly encourage you to check these out because there's a lot of ways to add analytics and metrics to a visual. I'm going to just delete the 2 lines that I have to show you how easy it is to add them back in. Delete that, delete my forecast. And one of the ones that I love the most, especially on the line chart, is the trend line. So go ahead, click that over here, click add, and look at that. Bam, immediately shows up, adds a indication to your data, and now, honestly, the variability that I had previously in here wasn't something that I could really tell that there was an upwards trend. And very easily now I can see that it is just a slight upwards trend, but there is still a trend showing up there. So immediate added value, and it's helping tell a story about my data. The other one that I like is the forecast line. So that is something that can come up in here. And by the way, both of these can be renamed, so I could just call this forecast line instead. There we go. And you have a few options to configure it. So the 10 points means that it will be 10 points out from whatever is on your axis. Now what this is these are each at a month and year level. So just to show you that, if I hover over any one of these, I should get, do I have Tooltip turned on? Give me one sec. Tooltip, there we go. Turn that back on. Now if I hover, there we go. Yep, November, and you can see December. So in this case, the 10 points for my forecast line over here means 10 months. If I instead want to anchor it to a specific period, because points, if you have a hierarchy, will mean if you're at the date level, it will be 10 days out. If you're at the month level, 10 months, quarter level, 10 quarters, etc. So you could fix it to say, I only want to show the next 6 months, hit apply, and then if I want to ignore any current periods, let's say I have an open month that has some volatile data, I can say ignore the last 1 month. It will hop back to the previous one. There we go. You can choose your confidence interval, and then if you wanted to, you could add some seasonality points in there, which will add a bit of variability to the data. There we are. So you can see, very easily configurable for both of these. All right, and the last thing that I want to mention in this discussion as well is this little icon that's up here in the upper right. What this allows you to do is add a report tooltip to the page. Now, historically, this was something that honestly was much harder to do. I had to use bookmarks or other stuff like that to configure all of this, and that was kind of a pain in the ass. So this is something that really allows me to really easily integrate per visual some kind of tooltip that will help explain what they're looking at. And overall, like, this is something that I love to implement because you can just put helper text into here. Now there's a few limitations that it has by default and a workaround that I'm actually showing you currently in front of us. So let me go ahead and walk through this. I'm going to go over to the Format Painter. I'm going to go down to Visual Header Tooltip. First thing you need to do, turn on Visual Header Tooltip down here. My gripe is the fact that this needs to be toggled for this to show up. This will not show up if this is not toggled. So I will show you exactly what I mean. With this off, I don't get that menu below. That goes against every other design in this menu in here. Like, there are no other toggles that has a toggle for another menu that shows up as a submenu in there. So I find this really hard to find for people who do not know it exists. You have to turn this on first, then you have to come down here and you can configure it. So I would love them to, again, add a on and off switch just right there with a little toggle. You'd be able to flip it on or off. So fingers crossed that someday gets changed. I have mentioned to the product team that I would love that as a update. So here is where I want to show you the limitation. The tooltip text right here, that is what we show if I don't attach it to a report tooltip page. We have a 250 character limit, and that is the maximum you can put into there. You cannot underline, format, or do anything with rich text formatting. It's just flat text that gets put in with a few basic customizations as far as color, size, and font family. Now, if you want to get around that, one recommendation that I have is you can attach a tooltip page to it. So I have a hidden page for information tooltip. I'm going to select that, and we're going to come down over to this hidden page that we have down at the bottom. Now, to create one of these, by the way, a tooltip page, if you're not familiar, all you need to do for the page settings is come over to page information, make sure that that is set to tooltip equals on, and then you need to just confirm what the page size will be. I have a tooltip here. You can also do custom or anything else, but in general, this is just something where you go through and you decide what page size you want. By default, the tooltip page size is 320 by 240 because it needs to be small when you hover over it so it doesn't take up the whole page. And all I did here was I put a text box in here, and now I have an option to bold. I have an option to, to underline, to italicize, anything I want. For rich text, I can configure in here. I could also add an image. I could add anything else that might help with the tooltip. So I have full customization over this small tooltip page to then be attached to the visual itself, which is what I'm getting right over here. There's the report tooltip popping up with my additional configurations. So you have an option to really easily just type in the standard tooltip text data if you want, or you can attach it to a report tooltip page and have a lot more configuration options as well. And as you can see, what we have is 3 really useful techniques that I've shown you so far. I've talked about the conditional formatting KPI dots that can show up. I've talked about the benefits of some of the items in the analytics pane that are over here. And then I also showed you the tooltips that are included in the visual header. Now, before I move on to the next demo, are there any questions about what you've seen so far? All right, now let's go ahead and move on to the next demonstration. And for this one, I'm going to talk about the narrative visual tooltip. I actually had a lot of fun making this one. Let me go ahead and show you the tooltip here and see if I can zoom in just a little bit. There we go, just enough. And I'm going to draw a few things in here so I can kind of point out some stuff. Where's my cursor? Okay, there we go, up at the top. So this is a text box that is using the new narrative visual tooltip options. Specifically, there's a couple of KPIs that are being returned. Again, let me find my cursor. There we go, here. And this one as well, and this one, and a couple more, and that one, and that one. Every one of these are values that are being returned from the model and actually recalculate just like anything else in a standard tooltip using the filter context. So I'm actually able to create a rich text narrative that says, in plain English, total sales was 26,000, which is 23% of the class grand total for this month, with sales growth of 7,000, with about 38% increase over the prior month. And I even included some top-selling product calculations. So this actually is showing what the top-selling product was for any of these things that I'm hovering over with the sales amount for that top-selling product. Go ahead and exit out of the drawing mode, and you can see that the values change every time I continue to hover over these. There's Contoso for the various different classes, and you can see that the values continuously recalculate. And also just for a little bit of fun, I included a bullet chart here at the bottom, which is a little outside of the context of this, but I wanted to add some visual into my tooltip. So this actually shows what the value is compared to the entire total for that brand down here. But let's discuss the narrative tooltip. So I have that on a tooltip page down here. I'm going to go ahead and navigate to that. Here we are. And let's go ahead and discuss the tooltip itself. And there's a few different things we can configure in here. One thing that I want to mention that I actually love, before I even get into adding the data in here, is the emojis can be added from your keyboard. So if you actually hold the Windows key and select colon, you get up a little emoji keyboard that lets you type things into here. So I'm going to actually look for money. I just type that in. Notice that the word money in here is underlined, and I can select from any of the icons that correspond to money. Select that one. Look at that. Now, let me close this. There we go. You can see that total sales, little icon just to add a splash of visual flair. And then all of these things are actually calculations that I'm pulling from my model. So I'm going to delete this and show you how to add one. So now I'm going to click right here where I want to add it. I'm going to come over to this. Let me get that out of there. There we go. So what I want to see is total sales. So total sales in current month. If I type that out, look at that. It auto-completes, and I have an option to select total sales in current month using the calendar date, which is the calendar date field in my model that I already have. So I'm going to select that. And now what that will do is return a result here. I have an option of formatting it as well if I wanted to. There we go. And I can format that as a currency. So really, really nice about this is I can not only bring in a measure, I can also apply a filter to it. So I can use the natural search engine in here to be able to look up a value and essentially, return a calculation with a filter attached to it. Now currently there's no option to just select from a list of measures. I really would just like to not actually have to use Q&A to find it. So I'm hoping with the next version of this, they have just a drop-down list. But for now, you can use the Q&A to search for calculations that are already in your model and then bring it into here. Now I will briefly show just some of the measures that I have in here, but again, the goal is not to write the DAX formulas. It's more to focus on really using measures to harvest them out of your model and to put them into a natural language text box. So I'm going to cancel that. I'm just going to Control Z. There we go. I'm going to put my value back into here. And I did the same thing with any of these other ones. Every single thing that's underlined is a measure that I retrieved from my model. This one is the top ranked product measure that I have. Another thing I'll mention too is when you put this into a Q&A visual like this, better said the smart narrative visual, you do want to, as a good practice, rename them so they have friendly names in here. So each time you ever click add a value, you had an option down here at the bottom to give it a friendly name. So I would encourage you to do that each time you do. Otherwise, and I've noticed some cobwebs where old ones kind of get stuck in here, but as you can see, you end up with a calculation that has no name. And you're not going to really know what it is until you click on it and maybe edit it, and then you can see what it was doing. So that's a good recommended practice. Make sure you give them always some kind of a friendly name. All right, so we've discussed this a little bit. I want to talk about a few other cool little things that I've done in here to give it a bit of an aesthetic polish. So number one was the visual that I mentioned down here earlier, which will show you the the bar value against the class grand total. So again, as a reminder, what that is doing, if I come back to here and I look at, let's say this one, maybe zoom out a little bit. So what it's doing, if I can draw, here we go, this column right here, the blue one, the other one on top of it, the green one, this guy, that is the equivalent of, if I can find my cursor, there we go, that's this. So it basically removes the class filter, which is all of these things at the bottom, and is just showing it against that. So you can kind of just see how much. As you can see, that 3.1 is a pretty large percentage of that, so it's going to take up most of the space. But as an example, if I hovered over this one instead, you can see that that's much smaller. So it just gives you some perspective. I found that the bullet chart worked very well for that. If you are interested in the bullet chart, it's not something built into Power BI, but it can be added from the Visuals Marketplace. So if you ever need to add a visual, you can certainly say get more visuals, and it will just take you to a marketplace to explore those at your leisure. A couple of other things that are in here, or maybe better said, the last thing that's in here. This is actually a great example of how to use a button to create things that aren't just buttons. I actually find that there's a lot of configurations to use for these, so there's many different ways that I found to utilize them, including the one you see in front of you. So the buttons themselves can have multiple things applied to them. So for the text that's in the middle, you don't have to just have, static text in here, which would be this. static text. Instead, you can use the f of x symbol to add a measure, which is a title, into the section in here, which will change dynamically. So in this case, it will format by field value, meaning it needs a measure to go into here. So if I look for title, there it is, smart narrative title. I have a measure that I built for this, and it will change dynamically whenever I'm hovering over any of the filter context in the main visual. So I'm going to come into fields, open up DAX. Let's take a look. Title. Bum, bum. All right, here we are. So let me zoom in a little bit. Come on. Right about. Sometimes you got to get the screen just right. Here we go. Okay. So let's use my handy pointer and I'll do some pointing. Okay. So what we have is static in the front right here, brand. So that corresponds to this. And then what I do is I'm just using max. You can do that on text. So it's basically grabbing the name whenever I'm hovering over the elements in my filters pane. So that grabs worldwide importers. And then I have a concatenation where I just have some generic text here for the divider and the class name. And then again, max sales class name goes right to there. So that's returning a dynamic title that when you populate it on the report page, it changes every time you hover over any of these elements in here. So taking a look one more time, you can see now as I hover over this, it goes from Crossware to AdventureWorks, and then as I change the other ones, it also changes the classes as well. So it will change with that, and it just helps to make sure that the filter text is very clearly indicating what they're hovering over, so there's no ambiguity around the data that they're looking at. So not only does this demonstrate some creative uses of other visuals and how to utilize tooltips in some ways, especially for the visual tooltips, I think it's a really good example of some really unique ways to be able to use the smart narrative visual not only on the main report page, which I think is what most of the other demonstrations have shown in recent blogs, but also how to incorporate this into a tooltip. I really like natural language text. I think for people who are non-tech savvy or non-analytical in that sense, it's nice to be able to read a summary of your data without having to look at a visual for it. So, it depends on, left brain and right brain individuals. But I think that covers it for this demo. So are there any questions that I can answer about this one? All right, let's move on to our next demo. Now this one looks pretty simplistic in its design, but it's honestly one of my favorite ones that I've done recently. Zooming in once again, taking a look at this, there's a few different things going on, and we're going to cover each one of them at length. So let me see if I can find the right date to get this to filter to some, there we go, red data. So notice one, the image in here has a little indicator that goes down. The red in the back changes to this color from green. So not only is this thing changing based off the slicer selection, the colors for the shadow have changed. I found that a really clever way to use shadows is you can actually dynamically, with some conditional formatting, change the color of the shadow to be some kind of KPI indicator. Maybe make it go back once again to green. There we go. So we have that. That's kind of thing number one that's happening. Thing number two, check this out. This button has two different states. When I hover over it, I get the value. So basically what it's showing me, and the number is not as important, but it's showing me that from the prior month to the current month, it went up by 14%. It's basically just a secondary value that I can show on top of my primary value. So I have an option to show two different values. And the card visual doesn't do this. So this is actually a button. Once again, buttons to the rescue, where they're very configurable. And then third thing that I'm actually doing on this is there's two different visuals on here. I have stacked a spark line on top of a button that I've made look like a card to create this really dynamic custom visual out of all these different elements that I've combined into this. So let's kind of walk through each one at a time. So to start with, I'm going to select this. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste it to make a secondary one. And I'm going to come over here, I'm going to right click, and I'm going to ungroup it. So what you can see now is that we have two different elements on here. So I'm going to kind of dissect it and show each thing one at a time. So let's start with the card. We've already talked about last time how your button text can be provided by a measure. Yeah? So what I'm doing here is I'm actually doing different states with different measures. One of the great things about buttons is the fact that I have all of these different states, So I have a default state, hover, and press. So default state is what is it doing by default. You have a hover state, so that's what will it do if I hover over it. And then an on-click state, or on press, is what happens if I click on it. So you have an option to configure it for up to 3 and 4 for disabled, but we're not going to cover that here because you don't really use it in most cases or very often. But at least the primary ones, default, hover, and press. So what I've been able to build is I used 2 different measures for the default and the hover. Now one thing to note, by the way, the default here, the button text that shows up there, that has to actually be formatted as text by the DAX measure. So I'm going to open this up. I'm going to show the measure in here. This one is, let me confirm what I used in here. There we are, page views KPI. Page views KPI, let's find it. There it is, all right. And regardless what's in here, again, I'm doing a few different things, mostly just configuring to make something look pretty, but here is essentially the end result. It's a formatted string that's taking the page views, making sure it's formatted as a number, a space in between it, and then the arrow down or the arrow up symbol, which is why I'm either getting up or downs, just based on some set of conditions. But I basically have one calculation to provide the main page views KPI, and then in here I also have the a secondary one that's being used for my on hover, which is the current month text. And same thing. I basically have in here another measure that's returning a different value with the arrows in it. So because I have specified a separate measure, let me close that, in the on hover and on default, it will basically allow me to now have this little cool pop-up that provides me essentially an embedded tooltip, as I like to call it. So a really nice way to add a secondary value. And if you wanted to, you could even add a third value for on click if you absolutely needed to. But for this, it does its job very well, and it's something that I think can add a lot of value if you utilize this. And the nice thing too with cards is this is something that is not available on single value cards. And better said, the nice thing you can do with buttons, which is this. I have the choice of alignment. So I can do middle, bottom, top with the card alignment. I can do left and right with any one of these. So, and actually better to show you on default. So I can do top, there you go, middle and bottom, and then left and right. So I have full control over the alignment of the card. And because I can move it up, I can now create space down at the bottom. And let me actually go ahead and fix my on hover. There you go. You can do alignment individually for each one. So because of that, I want these on the top, and that room makes room for this little line down here, which is why I can scoot it up. And I don't know why, I've still not figured it out, but for some reason, they decided to not design a single value card. Maybe a better shed to show you on this. This, sorry, let me just show, here we go. I'm going to put a card into the page because I want to show you the pain point. I'm just going to drag a value into here, doesn't matter what. There we go. So the thing with single value cards is the number is always in the middle and there's no formatting options for it. You can't go to data label, choose the alignment, that's just not available. It's always going to be in the center. And it frustrates me that I can't make any changes to the alignment. So in some cases when people have wanted different alignments, I have used the button, a blank button that's been designed like this to supply that into here. And if you want to know how to add those, by the way, it's just go into the Insert tab. You can go over to Buttons and select Blank Button and then just configure it from there. Add the button text with a measure, turn off the background, turn on borders, however you want to format it. I just basically add it from here. I don't assign an action to it, and I use it as a visual. And it runs just as fast as a single value card. So there's no performance hit that I've seen with doing format to text on your measure. The downside is you need to have measures specifically formatted to work with the button, but other than that, it works as expected with them, and it's honestly just has a lot more customization. So I really like this option. I think it's really cool in terms of its implementation, and there's a lot of creative uses for it. So, and in this case, you've seen so far, we've already talked about how you have that alternative hover value that can show up, and we've talked about layering in here. And of course, when you layer the two of them, a couple things to note. One thing you want to do is add to a group. So you right-click after highlighting them, select Group. There we go. That puts them into a group. And the other thing you need to make sure of, if you go over to the View tab, turn on the Selection pane, and I'll talk about the background shadow in just a minute. Inside of the group, you need to make sure that they're ordered correctly. The sparkling needs to be on top. If it's behind it, obviously it's going to disappear. And the other thing that's important too is you want to prevent issues like this. If a user clicks a couple of times, oh, well there goes the sparkline. It it disappeared out of the visual because this now popped to the front. If you want to prevent that from happening, you need to go to General and make sure Maintain Layer Order is turned on. With this toggled on, what that will ensure is that this will always stay in the background. You won't observe this in Power BI Desktop. It's still going to pop up, but when you publish this to the service, it will stay in the background. It will never show up and go on top of your sparkline. I will mention that these have to be in groups, by the way. If these are not grouped, the Maintain Layer Order does not work. So group it first, make sure they're in the right order, and then for the back ones in the very back, you want to have this turned on. If I only had Maintain Layer Order turned on for the sparkline, this would still show up. So in general, the visuals in the background that you don't want to show up in the foreground, those are the things that you want to have selected, Maintain Layer Order. All right, so we've made this. We've talked about almost everything in here. The last thing that I just want to talk about for this is I want to come down to Shadow, there we are, and talk about the color that's in here. So really cool color as well. FFX symbol is in this. If you click that, you'll notice that, again, formatted by field value, and there's a KPI color in here. So rather than a static color that I've selected from like a color palette, I have a measure that's in here. Control Z, go back. There we go. And then I'm going to look at KPI color. Very simple KPI color that's in here. Come on. There we go. I basically just have green and red text code colors that are in here. You can also use RGB. I just like to use variables to clean up my code, so my result is just, if this percentage is greater than or equal to 0, green. Otherwise, red. So it just changes the color dynamically based on the measure that I was looking at, which allows it to change the shadow color in the background there. So I found that that's kind of a fun use of shadows to, add a very subtle, soft little KPI in there without having it be the background of something else, which might be a little bit too loud depending on your scenarios. But as you can see, just that single card has so many different things happening for it and just a lot of different ways to display data, all with just a few configurations and layering of visuals. But overall though, before I move on to my next demo, are there any questions about this? Alright, now we get to talk about one of my favorite visuals that I built for Power BI. Now, for a bit of context, I want to go ahead and talk about this visual just a little bit. Now, honestly, one of the primary reasons that I built this is because back in the day, I was starting to build out a Google Analytics report, and one of the things that I had was something on their webpage that was a heat map by the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, day of week, and then hour of day. And it was a beautiful visual distribution of the data down to the day and hour level, and I just loved that. Like, it immediately just told me where the clustering and distributions were, where the highs and lows were, and like, all right, awesome, where can I build this in Power BI? So the first thing that I did is I did go to the Get More Visuals, and I checked out the visual store. Let that load up for a second, and I went to search for Heatmap. By the way, I am kind of annoyed that it starts with editor's picks. If you search immediately in editor's picks, you're not going to get a full list of everything. So you actually have to go down to all. Let's look for Heatmap. There we go. There are a couple of table heat maps that are in here, but as you can see, the reviews are, not so stellar, and just, this is not a particularly good visual. I tried it, just didn't really like it, so like, no, all right. Let's come back to the idea of using a native visual. And let me also talk about some things regarding this. So native to custom visuals, which would you use? The answer is the consultant answer, which is it depends. In general, there are good use cases for custom visuals, but also there's a small performance impact. I have seen people go down the route of covering their report in custom visuals and then wonder why their report's slow. I will just summarize to say that for security reasons, Microsoft wants to prevent too much sharing of resources or information between custom visuals and the model and anything else, so they've implemented some additional security features around that. Native visuals can share libraries when they load. So any common attributes like backgrounds, titles, axes, etc., they can share, but custom visuals have to load every element by scratch for itself because it's in a contained sandbox for security and safety reasons. So even though in the last 12 months they've gotten better at allowing custom visuals to load faster, they will still never quite be as fast as a native visual. So my recommendation, try with all possibilities any way to configure a native visual to do what you want before looking for a custom visual. And there are uses to use them, but just don't use them too quickly when you might find a solution with a native visual. And that's what I did. I started in here with a matrix table. We look over here. we can see that I built this out of a matrix table. Hour is on rows, weekday is on columns, and all I have is page views in here. So you might be wondering, like, how did I get this to show up? It's one of my favorite techniques in Power BI to turn what arguably is just a table of data into a visualization. You've gotten rid of the white background and black text, the sea of numbers, which it's kind of hard to find the patterns right now. Like, yeah, I can see somewhat in here that the numbers are bigger, but it doesn't just immediately draw my eyes, So let's configure that and get this to look like the heat map that I have on my completed tab. All right, so come over here. I'm going to come to my visual. I'm going to go over to page views, going to hit the drop down, conditional format, and let's start with background color. Bada bum, right there. Okay. So to start with, I would recommend to avoid reds and greens unless you really have good and bad data. My data isn't bad if it's small, it's just less. So better said, let's go ahead and do blue to a darker blue. Still indicates something that's like increasing in size or value, but it's more of a soft neutral color. So select OK. There we go. So it's starting to get there. I'm seeing the spread and the distribution. I'm seeing those dark shadows where I want to see the higher distribution of data or higher amounts of the value that I'm looking at in my table, but it's still not quite there. Now, to me, in a perfect world, I would like to be able to go to background color, select this, and somewhere in here, it would be great if there's just a checkbox where written in here, and just pretend that's some elegant handwriting, it says turn off data labels or show color only. The reason I'm saying I would love it in this is because in data bars, we have that. If I go over here to the drop down, conditional formatting, data bars, we have show bar only. So like, why can't there be a show color only option? That would make it so much easier for people to see. And honestly, back to my conversations again, to my idea that these kind of demonstrations, someday I would love for Microsoft to implement a way to do things easier, so then it gets rid of one of my talks. That just means that more people are going to know how to do this who've not seen one of my talks. So someday I hope this goes away as a presentation topic in this current presentation when they add a checkbox to make this easier. But for now, the solution is actually quite simple when you think about it, but it's not something you might have thought of in the first place. Apply the same logic to font color. It's essentially negating the two. So font color, come up here. I'm going to go to the light blue, go to the dark blue. Beautiful. Maybe actually do it. Come on. There we go. Hit OK. And look at that. Fantastic. I have that color distribution. I can tell where my highs, better said, my lows and my highs are, and I can still get that data label if I hover over it. And it will never break or have any issue because the font and the background are matching in color. It will always just basically negate each other. It's not something that, again, it's like 2 steps when it should be 1, but it still has the same effect and there's no performance cost. So we can now turn what is arguably a data table into a visual. So great way to rethink how matrix tables can be used. And it also encourages you to really explore native visuals before potentially going down the road of custom visuals, which again, highly encourage you to use at some point because custom visuals are great, but there is that caveat of a small performance impact and load time that you should be aware of. But that's about it for this specific demo. It's a very quick and easy one. But again, before I move on to the next demonstration, are there any questions that I can answer about this one? Now this one here is yet another one of my favorites that I really like to build. This actually came about from a client scenario where they had a very specific kind of visual that they wanted to build for a report. They wanted to show a value. They wanted to have some kind of a line here that indicated good or bad, basically whether or not the percentage or whatever metric I have was going up or down. And then they wanted the title and then kind of a readout down here at the bottom. So you can see as I select around that this actually changes. The data at the top, the bottom, and the color will change depending on which selection I've made. So I want to show you how I built this. And again, kind of the idea talking about how I managed to layer these visuals on in a very unique and clever way. So let's go ahead and copy this out, paste it. Here we are. Bring that over here. And again, this is a grouped object. So I'm going to right click and ungroup this. And let's take a zoomed in look. We'll notice a couple of things. There's my top, there's my bottom. So let's see what I used to build this. So to start with, let's talk about this top card here. Once again, look, there's a button. The button itself is actually all of this green at the bottom. This top part, that is the title on top of the button. So I actually configured this to basically make a really small little sliver down here at the bottom. Let me Control Z a couple of times to get it back to the size that I want. There we go. I made a nice little thin sliver for the bar, and then for the fill color, notice that the fill is right there. That's basically the button fill. I just made the button really wide and really thin. So that in here is just, once again, a fill color provided by a measure. Let this menu pop up here. There we are. And completed KPI colors, I can show you again just for austerity purposes. KPI color right there. Either one of these works. And again, just remember, I can choose the fill color as a measure, and I just have a calculation to determine, should it be green, should it be red, and just some calculation here to determine that as well. And typically, I prefer actually to use measures. You do actually have an option to set up the rule by color scale. I can just actually create a color change by rules themselves too, and just supply that by either a number or anything else in here. However, the problem is when I do this, I now have to do this for every single measure, or sorry, better said, every single visual I would ever want to apply this logic to. So keeping the logic in the measure means that I can reuse that measure over and over again for multiple visuals that might need the same color transformation logic. Now the top part, I'm going to Control Z a couple more times. Bam, there you go, the color's back. The top part is the title. Just like the button text, which can also be text, a dynamic DAX measure, the title can be that as well. So again, clearing that, I can type in generic title. I can also supply a measure title. So that, let me go ahead and Control Z. There we go. There is a measure being supplied into here. That is by completed amount. And again, anything that's put into here, I'll get that to close. Anything that's put into here will have to be a text format. So I think, let me remember which calculation here is that. Completed amount. Here we are. So yeah, that's why I have it formatted. Technically, you will need two measures for this, because you need one base calculation, maybe for your completed or your sales amount that goes everywhere else in your model. This one does have to be formatted, which converts it to text. So I can't reference this in other measures if I want to calculate it because it is text. And it has to be formatted too. If I don't wrap it in a format, any formatting that was in here originally does not automatically get included into the next visual. So it has to be formatted with however you want it displayed, essentially. So wrapping that in the format skin, again, there's no real performance impact for this, allows me to specify it into the title. So now I have one visual that is my top number, the little color KPI bar below it, and then this bottom visual down here is just a standard single value card. The title itself, simply just a title. That's it. Like, that part doesn't need to change. And then below it, there is a measure that's being added to the fields well in here, which is completed text. And that's just a concatenation to make it look pretty. So a few different things in here that I've done. I have the percentage, so let me do some drawing so I can help you with that. This is my percentage here. Or better said, var percentage goes to here. This one goes to my percentage there. And then I basically have a condition here that just determines if the arrow should go up and down. Yeah. So that goes into my second part, which then, of course, is being displayed right there. I'm a visual guy, so I like to draw. And then versus plan, of course, here, that is going down into that section to the end. And then, of course, the target at the very end, that is coming from just the formatted target value, which goes to the very end there. So I basically just created a concatenation, which gives me the string that populates into the bottom section. So a few different metrics that apply into there, and it displays whatever the customer wanted. But that's the end goal that they have in this card down here, is this custom card that looks just like a single card on the page, made with two different visuals, a button and a single value card, and it creates an entirely new visual that does not exist in Power BI based on the client requirements. So there's many, many good ways to layer visuals, and again, I think buttons are actually very clever in a lot of ways, because they have those different states. They have a lot of ways you can apply conditional formatting to titles and colors, that there's a lot of ways to customize it. So, I love the scenarios when a client gives me a requirement to say, hey, we have this in another system, can you make this? And I've never thought to make that before, but let me figure out how I can do this in Power BI. And there's enough tools in here that typically there's some way to shape and configure and use a visual in a way that gets outside of the box and ends up coming out with something that is invented. You know, I've never seen somebody build this before, and it's kind of fun in a lot of ways to be the first one to make something like this. I think this teaches you a lot of different ways to use formatting and the visual layering. But that's about it for this demonstration. So are there any questions on creating this kind of KPI line and combo card? And this next one is, again, one of the favorite things. And this next one is also something that came about from a client scenario. What they wanted to do is they wanted a trail that showed where they were in any kind of hierarchy drill down. In this case, you notice up here at the top that it goes from page views 2020 to Q2 2020 to May 2020. And that is actually what we're looking at on the axis down here. This is the month all the way down to here, and it shows you how I got there. So you can actually see this change. If we go back up to the top and then go all the way up to the year level, we'll now have an option in here where we have the 3 years. And if I just simply navigate through the hierarchy, nothing happens. But if I turn on, drill down, and as an example, click 2020, and then go to Q2, notice that the date is changing up here at the top. We can see that I've drilled into 2020. Now if I click Q2, Q2 is showing up, and if I click May, that also shows up. So this basically, in the title, will show the breadcrumb trail that's in here. And there's a little bit of formatting magic, and again, conditional formatting that is creating this. So we can come over to the Format Painter, and we can see here, zoom out a little bit. All right, go down to Title, and take a look right down here. We will see that it has title text that is showing up, and basically representing a conditionally formatted measure that's pushed into here, rather than, again, static text, which is something we don't want. So let me go ahead and show you the measure. If I open this up, we can see that it's pointing to a calculation called breadcrumb title. If we close this here and we take a look over in my measures folder, open this up just a little bit. All right, breadcrumb title, start the journey from here. Zoom in just a little bit. There we go. We can see that it is a concatenation of page views and date hierarchy breadcrumb. Come back over here, look at date hierarchy breadcrumb. Here's where the magic is happening. So a few things are going on in here. Let me zoom out just enough. There we go. Each of these rules is on one line. So to start the conversation, I have a few variables declared at the top. I have a year selection, quarter year selection, month and year selection, and then the result, which is what's being returned. And basically what it's doing is it's seeing if any value a single value is being returned for the year, the quarter year, or the month year. Now, if I actually pop up the IntelliSense to this, here we go. You can see that it returns the value when there's only one value in the specified column. Otherwise, returns the alternative result. Essentially what that means is that it's capturing the filter selection. When this, better said, when I come down to here and drill into, say, 1 year, now there is only 1 year left in this visual. So a single value is being returned, so it returns this name. Same thing, single value is being returned, it returns the quarter name, better said quarter year name, and if I can get the IntelliSense to go away, there we go, the month year name. So now what I do is I have a condition that I'm checking, because remember, if there's not a single selection made, meaning there's no filter on it, it just returns blank. So I'm going to check is blank at 3 different levels. Now, what I'm doing is I'm starting at the month year selection level. I don't start at the year level, because regardless of how granular I've drilled down, whether or not I've drilled into year, quarter year, or month and year, it will always have a year selection, however far down I get. So if I start with this condition at the top, this is going to be the thing that's evaluated. So basically, it's going to check not as blank, and the year selection will not be blank regardless if I've only drilled into the year and quarter, or the year, quarter, and month. So this is the only thing that would actually be returned. So let me show you just to be clear so you can understand this. If I actually put this at the top instead, there we go. Basically, screw up the order. So if I instead do this, there we go, and get rid of this line, and I'll fix this in a second, but I just want to show you why this order is so important. It's the same as any case-when statement in SQL. So let's go ahead and save that. There we go. Oh, and I do need to get rid of that comma. Beautiful. All right. So now, notice that it is automatically having an issue and now showing just 2020. So start from the top. Nothing's getting returned yet. I drill into 2020. Okay, working so far. But now, if I drill into quarter, no new information happens. If I drill into month, no new information shows up because this condition still gets met. So it only is returning that first evaluation that I have in my measure. So this, every single time, is always going to be the one that gets evaluated because this returns true inside of my switch statement, and that means that this is going to be the thing that basically returns this concatenation. So that's why I start from the top down. You start from the lowest level that is drillable. Go ahead and clean that back up. Put a comma here. Alt, carriage return. There we go. All right. Starts from the bottom level first and does a check, and then the next. So if you have 6 levels you can drill in, you will have 6 different switch trues starting from the bottom up. And it's basically just concatenation. It might look scary and long, but all it really is this is the concatenation at the top that's being returned. So just to point it a little bit, we have basically the bracket at the beginning, month and year selection. There's that thing that points to the quarter year, and then there's the quarter year selection, the name for it, another arrow that points to the next level, and this, and it finishes it up just, with another bracket at the side. So it's not really that complicated, it's just a concatenation that's being returned here. You can see that again if I drill in, go all the way back, here we go. I go to May, yep, you can see the bracket, the year, arrow, quarter year, arrow, month year, and finished with the bracket. So any formatting you want to include in there is totally fine. I like to format it this way, but in general, I really like this ability to be able to drill down through all these levels and, again, provide this nice little breadcrumb trail in the title. It also really helps if you happen to be taking screenshots or if you're exporting to PDF, which ideally, that's not the best way to use Power BI, but I understand people need to use it sometimes. So this does provide some nice filter context that doesn't necessarily show up, in print mode because you still have this option to hover over the filter context little menu that, maybe not menu, but status box that shows you what's being filtered in here. And that also can show you the filter context. But I think that this is a nice alternative to present it on the screen without requiring any mouse navigation. And again, I will now leave it open to questions if anybody has any questions about the demonstration that I just had on title breadcrumbs. All right, now for the last thing we're going to cover in this demonstration before we open it up to questions. Again, one of my favorite things is being presented with a client scenario, like, hey, we have a really specific idea that we want to see if you can implement. And I've never done it before, and this is an example of that. They wanted a single button click option where they could click, say, month, and then all of the visuals on the page switched over to month, or day, or quarter. So any time perspective, honestly, but what they were trying to avoid having to do is to come to the hierarchy controls, go down to the next level. Hierarchy controls, etc. So 4 clicks or more on their page to basically shift the hierarchy perspective on all the visuals. And there's no way to really do that outside of bookmarks. And this was one of those things that I never really built a bookmark to do this before, but it definitely will capture this selection. So I want to show you how to basically make this selection, as well as also point out kind of the trick that I'm using to be able to make these buttons here at the top, where it kind of looks like they're toggling on and off. So we've already talked in one of the previous videos a little bit about some of the buttons and the way you can configure them, and I'll continue that conversation a bit. So what I have in here, go ahead and open up my selection pane. Let's look at our buttons first. So each one of these actually has 2 different buttons. There's quarter selected, quarter not selected. So let me show you if I hide both of them. It's all right. So I have one version, which is quarter not selected. And essentially what I do with that to get it to look clickable is the default state is this color. When I hover, it turns a little bit darker. When I click, it turns even darker. So I basically just colored the fill color, a few different colors in here. The fill has my default light color, on hover, darker color, on press, even darker color. So what I actually do with my bookmark is not only does it toggle the hierarchy controls, it will hide this one and then toggle the visibility of the selected one. So it looks like I've clicked it and activated it, and now the selected one has no action, no bookmark assigned to it. It doesn't have any color changes, so it kind of looks inert and it looks clicked and activated. And it won't change until I select another one of these. So that's how I created the interactive looking buttons, and there's certainly many ways you could configure these. This is just the preference that I have, is to use colors to make a click effect, but there's a lot of customizations for it. So that's one thing we can capture, and then again we can capture the hierarchy controls. So we will go ahead and start with that. I'm going to set up a scenario where we're going to create the month selection, and you can see how I configured this. So open up bookmarks. Here we go. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by configuring my page to set up for the environment that I want. Let me close a few things here. All right, there we go. So I'm going to move it down to the month level, move it down to the month level, one more time, and one more time. All right, my visuals are now configured. That's step one. The other thing too is I need to make my month selected because my visuals are at the month level and I need my month button to also be activated, the other two deactivated. So I'm going to come over, I'm going to hide my selected for quarter. There we go. Unhide the not selected, hide the not selected for month, and unhide the month selected. Someday I'm hoping to be able to do this with one single button, but for now the two button switch works well enough. Okay. So now the next thing I'm going to do is, this is a best practice that I recommend, go ahead and make sure to select just the visuals or objects that you care to capture in your bookmark selection. So my buttons here, and then my 1, 2, 3, and 4 visuals. There's only a few other objects on the page, but the practice is showing you select the visuals that you want to update, because this will help to prevent errors and issues with your bookmarks. Now I'm going to go ahead and select Add, and let's walk through what to configure in the bookmark. So data, we need to have checked because that captures the hierarchy selection. It's, in a way, to me, it's not really related to filters or anything else. I get that drill down is a filter, but I didn't filter anything. I just changed the hierarchy level. So that almost seems like it could fit in display, but regardless of my personal preferences, that is what's captured in the data capture. So that needs to be checked. Display is capturing the visibility, whether or not they're toggled or not. So that needs to be checked. Current page doesn't matter because we have no point to use this bookmark to navigate between pages. So I'm going to uncheck that to make it very clear, if I come back later, I know what the bookmark is doing. Unfortunately, there's no list of things it's affecting or anything else. I would love a breakout someday, but for now, just make sure to toggle these appropriately. Now, down here, I don't want to affect all the visuals. I only want to affect the visuals. This is affecting just these visuals here and these visuals there. So this is a very important thing to toggle. I almost never make a bookmark where I use all visuals because I don't want to accidentally update the data of a visual or a filter or anything else. So I'm going to do selected visuals. There we go. Now let's take a observation. I'm going to go to the day level, unselect everything. All right, that bookmark worked that I've already had built. Go back to bookmark 4. There you go. You can see that it activated the visibility states for my buttons at the top, and it changed the hierarchy levels. And if you need to update it, it's just a matter of reselecting the visuals you have, maybe make any changes, add a new visual, and then you can come back and go to update. And that will basically update the bookmark for you. So a really useful way to use bookmarks, in this case being able to use it for hierarchy controls, but I think there's a lot of creative ways to utilize bookmarks because it captures so many things. Bookmarks also actually capture focus mode. I've seen people use a bookmark to create a focus mode icon that's permanently on the page rather than having to rely on this symbol in here. So explore the possibilities that you have with bookmarks and just see some of the out-of-box solutions that are available for them. Again, I will now open this up to any questions. And once we finish with this section, we'll open it up broadly to just more questions and general Q&A to finish up this session.